To flatten the image with a telephoto lens or to put people against the wall without any space behind them would be too simple, too naive, because photography can never imitate the paintings. I don't want to imitate painting. Contrary to what one might expect, I want to give great importance to the third dimension and had thought of using the wide-angle lens, which would correspond more to the point of view of people in the Middle Ages. It's difficult to explain all this. Space will be presented through enormous sets, the sky as a background, which should make everything even bigger. Those are words from director Éric Rohmer on his 1978 film Perceval. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and today we're talking about Perceval. Quick synopsis of the film is the exploits of Sir Perceval, a legendary exemplar of knightly chivalry and one of the champions of King Arthur's Round Table. The film stars Fabrice Lucchini as Perceval, André Dussolier as Gauvin, Solange Boulanger as one of the chorus members, Catherine Schroeder as one of the chorus members, and Marc Hérault as King Arthur. It's written by Éric Rohmer, based on the novel by Chrétien de Troyes, cinematography by Nestor Alamandro, directed by Éric Rohmer, edited by Cécile Dissougy, music by Guy Robert, and costumes by Jacques Schmidt. Today, my guest is Duran Aziz, and first-time guest, and bringing me a Rohmer film that I've never seen, and I was very excited to cover this one. So we're talking Perceval. I had briefly heard about this movie. Eventually I would have gotten around to it as a completionist, but it wasn't high priority. So when you said, hey, let's do this, I was like, all right, sweet. That bumps it up. So before we get into the movie, Duran, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, like I was telling you before we started recording, from what I've listened to, I really like what you're doing and kind of like focusing on a specific director or cinematographer for a month, I think is a really good method. I mean, I'm a really big proponent of that, kind of like going through like a filmmaker's filmography to kind of like track their progression like as an artist. Of course, I have some problems with auteur theory. Nevertheless, I do think that like there's something to be said about the director as an artist or the cinematographer as an artist or the writer as an artist, etc.
No, I definitely agree. That's my approach. And with some podcasts, and I love those podcasts too, where they kind of break down scene by scene of the film. It's less so that, it's more so how this film fits within that artist, body of work and where they were at. So we'll definitely get into that. But I thought what you said about how you navigate watching directors' filmographies or cinematographers' filmography is really interesting. I'm interested to hear about how you started getting into films that were outside of the mainstream.
That's such a hard question to like to answer, but I guess like film has always kind of been a part of my life, like ever since like I can remember, since I was like a really like small kid. Like I grew up watching like Charlie Chaplin and like Star Wars, like The Great Dictator, one of my favorite movies when I was a kid, and same with Star Wars. But I guess like more outside the mainstream films, for like films like outside of the United States, I probably started watching them when I was like a teenager, maybe like an older teenager, somewhat in like high school, but definitely more so in like the early years of my undergrad. Then I had like a couple friends that like introduced me to like Tarkovsky or like Bergman or Fellini. Like those like were some of like the three guys that I guess like a lot of like young cinephiles like kind of like discover when they're first want to find films outside like the quote unquote mainstream. Going through their filmographies in like somewhat chronological order, but kind of like picking and choosing between the ones that like I thought were like the most interesting was really incredible and really like opened my eyes to the possibilities of what cinema can do.
This sounds very similar to my journey also. I think people might say, it's obvious to get into the Fellini, Bergman, whatnot, but it's like you need those guys because also not only are they making amazing movies, but they let you explore outside of their filmographies because they're inspired by other people and they're big fans of other directors and they were always very vocal about it. So I think that if you want to start off with the big hitters like that, you should, and you're really not going to go wrong in that way at all.
Like even like Fellini, for example, will lead you like down a rabbit hole with like Rossellini or Pasolini
Hmm.
or all these other like Italian filmmakers from like the post-war
Yeah.
era, up until like the 70s and 80s, that were all kind of like in like similar circles or all like work together.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just like there's a whole world, and I'm still discovering new people, seeing new films. So it's never ending. It sometimes can feel overwhelming, but in the best way possible, at least for me. I'm wondering how you got into Romero's films and how you heard about him. What were the first ones you saw, and what caused you to be a fan, if you are a fan of his other work as well?
No, I'm a huge fan of Rohmer. I haven't watched all of his films yet, but I've watched a good amount at this point. I think what first got me into interested in him was his association with Cahiers du Cinema. He was like one of the five or six major filmmakers that are like credited with kind of like starting the French New Wave movement. I had of course like seen films by like Godard and Truffaut and some of like the left bank filmmakers like Rene and like Varda, but and Marker. But I didn't really have seen anything by Romer at that moment, partially because like his filmography was so intimidating. I mean, he has what, like 30, 40 years at least,
Yeah.
and like several in short films. Yeah, I mean, one day, I don't know, just probably on the Criterion channel, and then I threw on Mine at Mods, and I'm like, wow, this is one of the greatest films I've ever seen in my life.
Mm,
And from there, I like watched the rest of the Six Moral Tales, and then eventually went on to like Comedies and Proverbs, and watched some of his other movies here and there.
yeah, that's cool. I think I agree. Like, I think when I first heard about him, I was a little like intimidated maybe by how much, because I think that people view him as from a certain decade and not realizing he was making movies well into the 90s, and he was making movies in the early 2000s too. And it's like wild to think of how long his career lasted and how great, like, some of the best stuff he was making was in the 90s, even though he started, 3 decades earlier than that. So, yeah, he's a big one. It's been cool revisiting some films for this, but also just going through. I usually try and watch stuff I hadn't seen, also, time permitting. So it's been good to like fill certain gaps.
I don't think I've watched anything past a couple of the Tales of the Four Seasons. I think I've only seen like two of those
Mm.
so far, but yeah, he has like this like what like a World War II spy thriller from like the 2000s or something.
Yeah, I haven't seen
I
it,
don't know.
but
I
yeah.
don't remember what that's called, but that looked really intriguing to me. I'd like to check that out at some point.
Yeah, I mean, eventually I will finish because I still have a good handful, a couple handfuls of stuff left to do, but a lot of the early stuff I've already watched. The later stuff, though, what I can find, I'm definitely going to try and watch just to see what it's like, to be honest, to see him in like a more modern sphere. But today we're here to talk about Perceval. Percival. I'm not sure how people want to pronounce it in English. This is 1978. And I think when I heard about it, for some reason in my mind, I pictured it as being something that was much later in his career because I don't hear anyone talking about it, not realizing it was sandwiched in between something like My Night at Maud's. And then later on, we're getting stuff like Pauline at the Beach and all of his other bigger stuff like, The Green Ray and so on. So in between like Love in the Afternoon, Claire's Knee, My Night and Maud's, those late 60s, early 70s, he did like three historical period pieces. And then he goes back to what he's known best as like, modern stuff. He goes to The Aviator's Wife is the first one after the three. I don't know if you've seen the other two. I haven't seen them yet. The other two, which are I'm just reading. Yeah, the Marquise of O and then Catherine de Heilbronn, which is a television film.
And I didn't. It was a trilogy though. That's interesting.
I don't know if they're tied together. He just did
Or
three in a
like
row.
an unofficial
I
trilogy, the
think
same way.
yeah, same
Yeah.
way he's kind of known for doing that. How do you feel as someone who's I have seen the stuff prior and post, like the bigger stuff? How do you feel hearing about that he made this kind of random trilogy of historical films?
Well, to be honest, like before, like I was doing like research for Perceval, I hadn't even heard of the other two films in this like kind
Mm-hmm.
of like historical trilogy. I did read a little bit about Le Marquis du O, or whatever it's
Mm-hmm.
called, in relationship to Perceval, and like kind of comparing the two films.
Mm-hmm.
But even like early on when I was kind of like looking at his filmography and trying to like find like which ones I want to hit, this one was always like really high on the list because it seemed like so kind of strange and like different
Mm-hmm.
from the rest of his films. Like you said, he's much more well known for his films that are sent like contemporaneously, and like he only has like maybe a handful of period pieces. And from what I assume, he has no period pieces or any other films for that matter that look as insane as this one does.
No. Yeah, as far as what I've seen and from reading of people being like, yeah, this is the most outlandish version or like looking film of his. And I kind of assumed that I was like, there's no way he made a straightforward, medieval film. I was at least hoping he didn't because I typically don't love medieval themed movies. It's just like a personal thing. I don't love them. So I was really hoping that he did something different. And like from the minute it started, I was like, oh, okay, he really went out there.
Yeah.
But it's based off of these texts from Chrétien, and I haven't read them. I don't know if you have the text that they're based off of. They're all unfinished stories. And Rohmer is a big fan of history. Like it doesn't come up obviously in a lot of his other films, but this was, I guess, his chance where he wanted to bring out that personal interest into his own films. And someone I read in one of my research said it kind of feels like a high school education film and not in a bad way, the way where it feels kind of play like. And he translated the text himself but he stayed very true to it, where to the point where like I was saying, it feels like a play that they're putting on. And sometimes the actors and the characters are narrating out loud their inner dialogue or their actions. How was that for you watching this? Because it's again not like most of his scripts. A lot of his scripts are dialogue heavy, but this one is very particular. Was it off-putting for you?
Well, I think of course, like at first, like the first couple times, it's like, what is going on here? It's definitely a little
Mm-hmm.
off-putting. But I think that like when considering how kind of like strange and maybe like high modernist like the production line is, and especially in the way that it harkens back to like medieval paintings that depict the Arthurian legend, especially
Mm-hmm.
like those from the medieval times, but also some from like the Renaissance era. The kind of like spoken out loud narration fits within that, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I read this really good article by Jonathan Rosenbaum. He
Mm-hmm.
like did like a review of the film. I'm not sure if you read that, but like
Yeah.
the title of the article was called, yeah, Honesty and Artifice, which is interesting because like I think that the kind of like spoken out loud narration draws the audience's eye toward how artificial everything is and how like constructed everything is. And so maybe there's some kind of like postmodern element to that, maybe like a thread there. I'm not really sure like what to do with that personally, but
Yeah.
I thought it was very, very compelling at the very least.
I agree. And I think right off the bat, I was interested to see how this was going to play out. If it was just the beginning of the film, like the, you know, opening, like, and then maybe the ending was going to be like that, and see if he was going to carry it through, because this is a longer film for him. Like he typically is a tight 90, maybe 100 minutes. This is almost 2.5 hours. So it's like, I'm curious as to how he's going to sustain this without kind of feeling annoying or tiring to the audience. I think it looks great. The, cinematographer that he's working with, he's Nestor Alamandros. He's worked with him before on several films, but this film looks a lot different than his other films. That's
No.
also due
Yeah.
to the sets. But just like the visual tones and like the coloring looks a lot different. And it just kind of feels like they are on a sound stage. For some reason, it works though, because it transports you into that world. And I was reading what he said, but that he didn't want to make a film that was supposed to be an honest depiction of medieval times. He's like, that's not what this is about. This is about these characters and what they're going through and how overly dramatic it is, to be honest, and how overly dramatic Perceval is. So yeah, I'm wondering how you feel about the cinematography in this and how the way the film was shot and the way, like we've been talking a little bit about the sets, but how it's just so strikingly different from everything else he's done, at least of what we've seen.
I read this cool interview from him done by Gilbert Adiyar from 1978, and in it, Romer's talking about how like he wants to like he wanted to avoid naturalism in this film, and he says that and this is quoting him, but making Percival was also a means of getting off certain well-trodden paths, avoiding the trap of naturalism, which I feel has completely exhausted his possibilities. I think it's really interesting to compare this film to like another Arthurian adaptation from the similar period by another French filmmaker, Robert
Mm-hmm.
Bresson, his film
Yeah.
Lancelot du Lac or Lancelot of the Lake, which on the other hand, that film is very like naturalistic
Mm-hmm.
and makes use of like shooting like in real forests and like in like real castles, I assume, and that kind of thing, versus this film, which is very, very much kind of fantastical, but also oddly enough, still doesn't really have a lot of the magical or like pagan elements of the Arthurian legend, which I thought was
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Definitely more kind of leaning in toward like the Christian themes of the legend. In fact, like from what I've read, like this film is a very, very close adaptation to the original text. Preserving somewhere I read like it's like preserving about like 2/3 of the original text, those like original 9,000 stanzas that were written in like the unfinished version. But at the same time, Romer decides to end the film with this kind of like strange recreation of the Passion of the Christ, of the crucifixion, which is
Yeah.
completely like his own invention. Like that's not in the original text at all. And I'm sure we'll get into that later, but sorry to answer your question about the visual style and like how different it was. I mean, yeah, it's immediately striking. Like when you first, like you said, when you started watching the film in the first like 30 seconds, you're like, what the hell is this? Like, what am I looking at here? And I think that like there are a lot of Romerian elements in this film that are consistent throughout the rest of his filmography that
Mm-hmm.
we'll get into, I'm sure. But the visuals are like so unique and so different. I mean, they certainly don't look like anything else that Romer has done. I mean, the one thing that really sticks out to me there are like the trees that are
Yeah.
like weird and like metallic and kind of
Yeah.
like I don't know, kind of like circularly shaped. I don't know. It reminds me. It's very like it reminds me of like high modernism. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
like an art history guy. I don't know like too much about that, but from what I'm understand, like that's kind of what it reminds me of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you were talking before I even mentioned the trees, that's what I'm picturing. I think that's what stood out to me the most immediately, where I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like I wonder what the thought was behind that. I know he sort of talks about it, but he didn't talk about, I'd love to read something from like the set designer and
Yeah,
how that came about because it's really wild. And these sets are very minimal, but the stuff that is there is very striking, and I have to assume they're for a purpose, obviously. So it's interesting, really just kind of making it into, as you said, a bit of a fantasy, even though there's no actual fantastical elements happening within the story at all, apart from maybe if you consider the end a fantastical retelling of it, even though it's still straightforward.
and also like the spear that's like bleeding and like the witch that like
Yeah,
appears to him at one point. But yeah, it's very
the
much
witch is
like
cool.
low key. Yeah, that was cool. It's very much like low key compared to like what Arthurian legend is more known for.
I mean, I don't know that much about that era, and I definitely never heard of Percival before. So I went in pretty cold. I was like, I'll let him tell the story and honestly assume that he just kind of fabricated most of it. So reading that it was very close is kind of wild. That I was like, oh, there's a lot going on in this story. I'm curious to know or hear your thoughts on the performances because we've got like a chorus in this, and that's great. I love the chorus because I think in a film this long of this subject matter, you need something to kind of break up what's happening, and that brings, at least for me, it brought an element of a little bit of relief when you're starting to get maybe frustrated with this character. So I like the chorus, and I like the side characters. I loved the witch when she appeared. Honestly, could have had more of her. But
Yeah.
our lead character, our lead actor, what are your thoughts on his performance, and if there are any other performances that stuck out to you?
liked him. So the actor I'm looking at him up now, it's Fabrice Lucchini, I believe. I thought he captured kind of like Perceval's like youthful naivete very well. Especially at the beginning. I mean, also something I want to mention, there's a lot of like really funny moments in this film. And like especially like going back to like the narration. There's like some like kind of like funny like puns and gags like
Mm.
within the, which I like I laughed out loud like several times. But especially like at the beginning, it's like really funny when he like goes up to the Knights of the Round Table
Yeah.
and he starts like
Yeah.
touching like their chainmail and he's like, "Were you born like this? Like
Yeah.
what's going on? This is so cool." I feel like his face is just he's got like a really good dumb guy stare, I think.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um and he definitely like nails that look. And eventually, like as like he grows older, as I think this tale takes place over several years, there's like a
Hmm.
5 year jump at one point. I think that like he like slowly like matures and his like demeanor becomes like slightly like more serious, as like his character is kind of like going through like his whole arc. So I
Hmm.
really like that lead performance. I was curious, like, what are the other performances that like stood out to you?
I thought the woman that he kisses non-consensually was interesting too, her performance, because it is melodramatic in the way the plays would be of the time. And I think it really set my mindset on who Percival was because of what was going to happen to her. And when she comes back again later on in the film, it was really heartbreaking because for some reason, the way she reacted to it, she was on my mind for the whole time. And I just kept waiting. Are we going to see her again? What's happened to her? Because the knight has said what he was going to do. So I liked her
Yeah,
performance. Fabrice is interesting because I was looking at his filmography and I guess he's also in Claire's Knee, but I don't fully remember who he is. I assume he's one of the guys that's hanging around there because he would have been quite young then. I know that Rohmer loves when he does have a male lead, typically they're very kind of soft, looking. And I say that in not in like a demeaning way, but they're very soft, clean shaven. They look kind of like little boys and they act like little boys, even though they're trying to betray that. And I thought the choice to have that conversation with his mother before he even leaves was interesting. Obviously, it's, I assume, part of the text as well, but to include that, because I thought it was kind of funny. I was like, oh, she's saying, don't kiss girls with other consent. It's like very much like a school, after school special style and the way she's talking about it. And I was just like, oh, okay. And then he immediately goes against it. And I was like, that's so weird because like immediately then you're like, I'm not on this guy's side. But then you're following him and you're like, he's really not intelligent. So I'm wondering how you feel about that because as to both of us not having read the original text, knowing that it is pretty close to the original text, but with some additions from Rohmer, how you feel about this being the lead character as it compares to other male lead characters in his films, because occasionally he'll have male lead characters. I say most of the time it's women, but when he does have male lead characters, they're often unlikable. And this one too, at least for me, and I'm wondering how you feel about him.
I definitely feel like this is like very much in line with a lot of the other like Romer protagonists. In the
Mm-hmm.
sense that like at the beginning, especially like in Six Moral Tales, for example, like all of his protagonists are like very much kind of like annoying pseudo intellectuals that have these like big kind of like ideas about life and like the way to live. And then like as they like experience some kind of like relationship or whatever, then those like ideas like slowly become to start to shatter and they like betray like their own ideals. Percival isn't exactly like that, but he definitely like experiences an arc of maturity like those
Mm-hmm.
other Romerian protagonists do. Though that being said, Romer himself said something really interesting that I don't even sure if I completely agree with about this protagonist. And in that same interview he did with Gilbert Adair in 78, he said that I like Percival, who is, I should say, closer to the feminine characters of the Six Moral Tales. One could compare him perhaps to the collectioniste from La Collectioniste in the rather insouciant way he collects his adventures, which I think is really interesting. And I don't know if I agree at all, but I'm curious
Yeah.
what you would think of that statement.
That's really interesting. I guess half of that statement I can agree with that. Yeah, he is kind of like, her and collecting adventures and stories, but him being like the more similar to his feminine characters, I can't agree with that. And sometimes, an artist has their own vision and the audience is like, I don't think so, but that might have been your intention, but it didn't come across that way. I think he's way more in line with his male characters because I don't know if he's saying that because he's overly emotional and because he grew up with his mother and he seems very innocent, and I'm not sure how I feel about it if that's why he thinks that.
Which like isn't really true of the female characters at all in the Suspense
No,
Tales either. Yeah.
no.
Or maybe like Claire, but she's like literally a child. So
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an interesting take on this character. I would say, yeah, he's more in line with the other men that he writes, but he's not like the lead in Claire's Knee either. I think he has less agency than a lot of the other men. So maybe that was his reasoning. I'm glad that you brought that up because I didn't read that. I think that's really interesting that he thought that.
it's really unexpected for me. Like I really don't know what to think about that at all because I definitely disagree with that statement.
Yeah, I'd have to disagree too. Sorry, Eric, but we're not on your side there with that. I was reading actually kind of along the same lines the way we were talking about. Someone said that his distinct generosity towards his characters, some of them highly flawed, is as much evident as it is in his other films. So essentially what they're saying is that he gives a lot of grace to the characters. I don't know. I've always said that I think that he's pretty judgmental of the male characters he writes, and I think he's not trying to paint them as villains. He's just being like, these are people with major flaws, but they're still human. And I think he's doing the same here. And he is a little bit generous, but I don't think he's excusing his behavior. But I'm wondering how you feel about that because I think what in my research I was reading, people were like, oh, I think he's saying it's okay that he's like this because he's naive and so on. And I'm like, I don't know that I read it that way.
Probably the most disturbing scene in the movie is the beginning when
Mhm.
Perceval like, sexually assaults the maiden, and like I don't think he's excusing that behavior at all, really. I
No.
mean, like the way that it's presented. I mean, you commented on her performance in that scene. Like, I mean, it really like made me like uncomfortable, and like it was like hard, kind of like a hard scene to get through. But at the same time, there's like that really like weird chorus that kind of like narrates it while it
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going on there, but I would agree. I don't think that he excuses like the bad behavior of his characters. And maybe that's more so for his male characters than his female characters, but even in that case, like there's definitely like some female characters in his films. Like I'm thinking like Pauline from Pauline at the Beach, where I think that he's very like critical of. But I don't think in like a like demeaning way necessarily. I think that he's more critical of his characters in a way to portray the fact that like there are like flawed human beings. And I think in Percival's case it's maybe like more extreme as this is like a medieval narrative rather than like I
Hmm.
don't think that anything like that bad happens in his other films. Well, I guess besides like the dear pedophilia from Claire's Knee, but like
Yeah. Yeah.
um which
Yeah.
we can talk about that later. I have a lot of problems with that film, obviously, but
Yeah.
um, I'm I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I would no, I 100% agree. I don't think that he's excusing the behavior at all. I think I'm glad that he as difficult as it is to get through those scenes, I think and not that I don't think you ever really need a rape scene. I think that implying that these characters are capable of this is important because it's unfortunately accurate. So because we don't often get violent scenes like in his films, to be honest, there's almost no, at least physical violence. There's probably emotional abuse that runs through, and then Claire's Knee on its own separate wavelength there. But it's very rare that you see something so jarring in his films. So I am at least glad that he didn't shy away from that by trying to keep, true to his aesthetic because I think he likes things to be kind of neat and honest, but not trigger anyone. But I think by doing that, he's just being like, this is who these characters are. I'm not going to sugarcoat him and make him out to be a hero, even though the ending is questionable too, which we can get into.
On like the question of like violence in his films, this film, I think in general, is not that violent, like especially to his filmography. But there's a few scenes of like violence, but like physical and like sexual violence. The one scene that we mentioned previously, but also the scene where Perceval kills the Red Knight, I think is like very distinctly violent when compared to like everything else I've seen by him. And to my knowledge, that's like one of the only scenes that like actual blood is shown like on screen. I mean, so we basically in that scene we see Percival throw his spear like into the eye of the Red Knight, and it's really like violent, like kind of really like gross gesture. I actually I went like, oh shit, when I saw that. Like I verbally said that like out loud because I did not expect anything like that to happen. But I think is really important because and I was reading about this somewhere, I don't remember where, that kind of like outburst of violence is pretty unique to the film, as like I think it represents Percival's kind of like naivete. And eventually, as he matures and he becomes like a more honorable, moral knight, he learns from the noble man, the honorable man, I don't remember his name, to like spare people instead of like killing them. And so, like after that, I don't think that we see like an intense level of violence from Percival.
Yeah, not from him for sure. No, I also reacted the same way. Because it's funny because like you and I have seen a million films that are way more violent than this, but when you're in the mindset, when you're watching a film and you know who the director is, something like that is shocking because you're like, I wasn't expecting to ever see anyone get a spear through the eye in one of his movies, even though the story
Yeah.
obviously, it makes sense for the setting and like the character, but I just was like, I didn't think they show it, to be honest. I thought it would be something off screen. So when it happened, I was like, whoa.
Yeah, no, exactly. Which is like interesting too, because like from what I was reading, the author, I forget his name, didn't often like write the violence or fighting. He was like very much like bored by writing that. So he would always kind of like use narrative ellipses, like, and then another fight happened, but I don't have to describe it to you because you know how it goes. Perhaps this was like Romer's own kind of creative choice for that scene. I don't know.
That would make sense. And that's interesting that he did that. And maybe he just secretly kind of just wanted to have one scene like that, one movie, and he's like, this is the time and place. If I can't have it.
Gnarly. I thought it was sick. Like, hell yeah. It was dope.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool. I was just like, wow, okay. And then I thought maybe is this going to become more of a, action film? It definitely did not. um, so we get the one scene, but that's okay. Another violent scene, which we've been alluding to, we mentioned, but it's not violence that he commits, it's violence against him, really. It's the scene, the crucifixion of Christ, and Percival is a Christ in this. At this point, because it happens essentially in the last 20 minutes in the movie. So we've been watching this for 2 hours at this point. Nothing could have prepared me for it. I didn't realize you were going there. I wasn't ready. So before we actually get into that scene, like what were your initial thoughts when that started happening?
I was so confused. Like I thought I'd missed something previously. I almost like rewinded to like replay it. I mean, it really threw me off too because like it's a very like anachronistic scene too.
Yeah.
In the sense that like the crucifixion is happening by like medieval soldiers, in like the medieval times, all within the very fantastical Romerian world of Percival. So there's all these like weird different levels happening, and I was just completely thrown off a loop. I honestly like to right now, like I have no idea what to make of it. Like it's kind of similar to the Sir Gawain side story in the sense that like it's kind of Gawain's story is like kind of tangentially related to like Percival's. And I believe one of the reason why Romer included that was because that was actually in the original text. The whole Gawain side plot. I mean, personally, like I don't even know if he needed it, but since he wanted to do like a very literal adaptation, I understand why he put those scenes in. But this crucifixion scene, such a strange way to end the film. I think it works on the level of like seeing Percival's arc through, because like the film ends with him just kind of riding off onto the next adventure. It's not very like satisfying, but he comes to some kind of like spiritual revelation in that moment which perhaps is the point of the scene.
Yeah, I think that's how I read it too. And I think if this was the first Romero film I'd seen or I'd watched, I would have been extremely confused. But because he does have that element of Catholicism that runs through a lot of his films, I was like, okay, so this is him bringing that in. Again, it's still very random to have it at the very end. And I just remember being like you said, I was like, did I miss something? And because I don't realize when we switch to this, and I was gonna rewind it, but I was like, maybe they'll explain it. Maybe on a second watch, I don't even know if you would still understand where the flip switched at that point. But
Really jarring.
it is jarring. Like even just now thinking about it, because it's at the end of the movie, and I watched it last night, so it would be fresh. And that's one of the scenes that sticks out the most to me. Obviously, I just think I don't know. I'm always curious, and I'm curious to hear what you think also because of the Catholicism that runs through a lot of his films. And I don't know that I ever really picked up on it, other than My Night at Mods, which is like overtly speaking about that. But other films, rewatching or watching for the first time and picking up on it, like characters who are going through a big life change and they gravitate towards the church. Like I remember it was in Tale of Winter and a
Mm.
few other ones that I watched where the church came up and it was kind of like the judgment point for these characters. And it seems like that's what it is for Percival too. It's a lot harsher in this. And that doesn't happen in his other movies where, they turn to the church. But I've always been curious because I haven't read that much of him talking about his own faith, but it comes up often enough to the point where I'm like, is he someone who is super religious and thinks that there should be some sort of judgment, or is he judging the church in that way? Maybe it's both. I don't know if you've read anything or what your thoughts on it would be.
I would really be curious to read more about that. I also am not really sure. But
Yeah.
at least from what I know, like I think he is like, yeah, definitely religious, spiritual to a certain degree, and also
Hmm.
like I don't think he was ever like political, but from what I've read, he's definitely more leans like kind of like conservative, and I think that kind of like religious slash like conservative morality comes through, especially in the moral tales and also comedies and proverbs for sure. And I'm thinking of
Yeah.
like the Aviator's Wife, for instance, in like that series. But I think that like it's not his kind of like moralism isn't at this like level where it's so like ideological he's like unable to critique it. He's like a
Hmm.
very like
Yeah.
I mean, obviously he's a very like intelligent guy and very like well thought out, and the nuances of his arguments or the themes that he wants to represent, I think, come through very well in his film.
I agree. That's exactly how it reads. Like that he is religious, but he's not to the point where he's not able to realize the pros and cons, essentially, if you want to boil it down to that. And I think that's why the way it comes up in certain films is that's why it's presented that way. This one is interesting. I almost want to see kind of like a short film of that, like have it drawn out a little bit more
Mm,
and have it be its own thing because it was beautifully shot and well, I'm not gonna say it was fun to watch because it's not fun to watch that, but it was very interesting to end the film that way for sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm hoping if whoever is listening, you've watched this movie because I don't think you should hear about this first. You should watch it before you hear about that scene
yeah.
for sure. But yeah, I'm wondering, are there parts of the story, the filmmaking that I haven't brought up yet that you want to chat about?
One thing I want to touch on are the gestures throughout the film. The way that like the blocking is done and a way like
Hmm.
hand motions and the way like the body moves in the film. I found that to be really interesting. From that same interview that I was talking about earlier, Romer kind of like talks about his kind of philosophy behind the gestures, and he says that I saw an overall system of gesticulation which would justify every such movement, and finding the key was less tricky than I thought. I observed that it was enough to pivot the forearm around the elbow, keeping the elbow close to the body, and never move the upper arm. And like this kind of like attention to gesturing is something that I find a lot in film, like to a certain degree in films by Jean-Pierre Melville. I find that like
Okay.
the way that they direct actors is very specific in the way they want to like make gestures. And I think that like the really like stiff gesturing in this film definitely like reflects the medieval paintings which inspired the production design and cinematography.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
No, that's really cool. The Melville comparison, I hadn't thought about it, but like it makes perfect sense because I love Melville and I love the way he directs the actors because you'll see Denon in other things and he's not behaving that way in his other films. So he was directed that way. This one was interesting too. I love when there's very distinct blocking in films, and I noticed it here. I don't know that I noticed the kind of stiffness of the arm gestures. But now that you say it and read it out, I was like, okay, I do see that. And it does match, the paintings of the time. I was reading kind of an interview with the cinematographer, and he was saying Rohmer doesn't leave anything up to chance on the day. Everything is planned out to the point where it's like you get on the set and it might seem like he's just kind of free flowing, but no, he's planned everything out that way. And you could definitely tell it in this one. The other ones feel more like it feels like just people talking and having conversations like he just turned on the camera, and that's also testament to directing and the acting. But here it feels like everything was written down to, the second. And I think that's why it works, especially with those sets and the backgrounds and the way it feels. Because I think if they were just acting as though, 70s actors would act, it would be a little bit off-putting.
I was reading this chapter from a biography of him and the chapter about Perceval, and like it said there that apparently they had been rehearsing this film for like a whole year before shooting started,
Wow.
which is crazy. Like the main actor, Lucchini, he had been like practicing like sword fighting and like horseback riding for like in like his spare time while like working like two different jobs. And
Oh,
like
wow.
also like they had run through like the whole script so many times, including like reading the entire Percival story, like the original story, like several
Hmm.
times, that like Lucchini like knew like literally all of the lines by heart. And according to Romer, like that's kind of what made the shooting like go really smoothly because like everyone was already like on the same page for like basically like a year in advance. The film actually only took like 4 weeks to shoot apparently, and they were like 3 or 4 days ahead of schedule when they finished.
Oh, wow. I mean,
Hmm.
I feel like that makes sense. And like, it's definitely not how he proceeds from other films that I've covered or just other knowledge on other films. He doesn't typically proceed that way. So he obviously took extra time because he wanted to be as faithful as he possibly could. So I think it works. And I wonder how it must have been for that actor to sit with this character for so long. So yeah, I would be interested to hear how he felt about it. Looking at his filmography, he's been in a few other things that other French films I've seen, but nothing, I don't know that he was ever starred or starring in anything. So it's interesting that he was the star of this one, but I think it works.
I think so too. Yeah. Got a question. I was
Yeah.
curious. I mentioned this before, but obviously this film is very different than the other Rohmer films that we've watched. But I was wondering, what were like the distinct Romerian elements, be it like themes, visuals, ideas, that kind of thing that you notice in this film that you also notice in his other films too?
Yeah, probably the casting of
Mhm.
the main actor, because although I didn't recognize him from Claire's Knee, and he's been in a couple other films of his later on, but again, not distinct enough, it was the kind of soft looking face, kind of fish out of water look that the actor had on this that I felt was like, okay, this is a Romer male lead right off the bat, even if it wasn't obvious that he was the lead. I was like, that's the guy. And then the Catholicism element at the end felt very Romer to me. Those would be the two main ones because I think visually his other ones just feel so because he's always shooting on location on the other films. And this one's obviously not. So that's a main thing that was just so different for me. So it was harder for me to situate myself in this film than it would be the other ones where as you can turn on Pauline at the beach, you can turn on the Green Ray and you're like, okay, I know what film I'm watching. This one was a little different. So I think those two themes or elements situated me enough. But other than that, I guess the heavy dialogue and but again, the way they're speaking is just so different than they would be speaking in other films. So there weren't as many for me. But how do you feel?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, like this film is very unique, I think, in its filmography. That being said, there are definitely some of elements that I see here. Like I touched upon this before, but I think that the arc, the maturity arc that Percival goes through is
Yep.
similar the smaller arcs that specifically it's like his male protagonists go through in like comedies and proverbs and also moral tales especially. In that
Hmm.
like, they start out very like idealistic or with all these like pseudo intellectual ideas in their head that eventually get kind of like broken down as they like experience the real world. Beyond that, definitely like you mentioned, the spiritual elements related to like Catholicism, I think are very consistent throughout his filmography. And also I guess the like the casting and like the focusing like on young people too.
Yeah.
As a lot of I think most of Romer's protagonists, honestly, maybe all of them that I've seen, maybe except for a couple, are like early 20s, mid 20s, like students or college students or just like young adults. And this film I think is very much about like growing up and maturing and becoming an adult, as I'm sure that like the original text, that's probably an important theme from that too. So in that way, like it's pretty consistent with Romer's other films.
That makes sense. That it's kind of like a coming of age story. And now that you said it out loud, I was like, yeah, I guess he doesn't really focus on anyone who's like not in their 20s, maybe 30s max, but he's really anti older people in that sense. He's like, I'm not really interested. I guess he wasn't interested to see his life as he was living it on screen. He was maybe more so reminiscing of his youth, which is fair. It's his work. He can do what he wants, but I can't think of anyone. Like I don't know how old. I can't remember how old the guy in Claire's Niece is supposed to be. He doesn't look
Like
like he's in his
85 or
20s.
something. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, pretty much. It's a film that, like, we could talk about it forever, but I think with all films, obviously, you should definitely watch it. I think it's one because there's a lot going on in this that it definitely would be beneficial for a second watch. I don't know that I'm going to run to rewatch it. I think you should give yourself some space in between watchings, or viewings, I should say, because there's a lot and it can be a lot heavier than his other films. It definitely doesn't feel as light as the other ones. Some of them feel light and airy, and you don't feel a weight after you've watched it. This one, there's a bit of a weight going on. Definitely say that there's so much going on. There's no way that I captured everything on the first watch for sure.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I definitely want to like at some point read the original text and then kind of compare it
Hmm.
to like a watch. There's a couple good articles I didn't get a chance to read about that like compare the two, the original and then this adaptation, but I'd be really curious. And also like I don't know French. I know like a little bit, not a
Hmm.
lot, but I would love to like look at his translation if that's like published somewhere of the
Yeah.
of like the original Perceval text. That sounds fascinating to me.
Yeah. I wonder if it is out somewhere. I wonder if yeah, it was, released in like a book format. You could get it from like the library. I'd have to look into that
Mhm.
actually and see. Because I know he has even because I'm looking at my box set. I think it's for the Moral Tales. There's a book in there of all the tales that he wrote prior to filming them. So that's cool.
Yeah,
So I wonder
yeah,
if there's
yeah.
one for this. But before I let you go, I still have two more questions for you. We're still talking Romero, we're still talking Percival, but shifting gears to the last segment of the show and credits. First question is the starter film question. So, as someone who has seen quite a few of his films, if someone comes up for a recommendation, they've never seen a single film of his, what film would you recommend they start with? Then why?
Honestly, I think the one I started with, My Night at Mods, is a really good one because that's either the so what I think the fourth or the third of the six Moral Tales. Even though that's the case, I believe that was the first, or I think the first or second feature film that he filmed for the Moral Tales series. But it also is like a really great kind of like it captures kind of like the ideas of that series really, really well, and just like on a film by itself it's incredible. Like it's like one of my favorite movies of all time. I would say if that doesn't capture you, then River might not be for you. If I'm being totally
Yeah.
honest. And yeah, from there, I think it would be great to like go through the rest of the moral tales, including like the short films that like begin it, The Bakery Girl at Monaco and Suzanne's career, and of course all the other films in that series. And then yeah, just watch everything else by him because everything I've seen by him, except for a couple movies, has been incredible.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting that you said that about My Night at Mods because I think there's a couple movies of his like that, or I would say you could start with The Green Ray, something like that. I don't know that I would recommend Claire's Knee to start off with because that can be off-putting. And I, as a very brief side note, because I feel like I've mentioned this before on the show, but a friend and I have a little film club, and I was wanting to go through some more Romero films, and she'd never seen anything. And I was like, "Oh, let's do Claire's Knee," because it was like next on my list, and she has not forgiven me for that. So,
God, why would you do that?
I know I was like, I felt bad because I was like, oh, I hadn't seen it, and I was like, oh, so I redeemed myself by us doing Pauline at the beach a couple of months later, and she's like, okay, fine. But Claire's Knee, she brings up all the time. She hates it.
It's so unfortunate because like that movie is like such beautifully shot,
Oh
and
my God, it's one of the most beautiful films I've seen.
yeah, and like there's a lot of good stuff in it, but like what's with the French and pedophilia, man?
I
Like just
don't
like
know.
can you chill? Like, do you know about like sorry to go on a tangent, but like
No,
do you know about that
please.
letter that was signed in like the 70s with like all the different like French intellectuals to like lower the age of consent to the age of 14?
No. Or if I did,
Yeah,
I've omitted it from my brain.
sorry to bring it back up, but
Oh, wow.
yeah, apparently like there's this letter that was signed by like Foucault, like Simone de Beauvoir, Gilles
Really?
Deleuze, Derrida, like all of like the big like French intellectuals at the time to like lower the age of consent in France. Anyway, it's super weird. There's like something wrong over there, man.
No, there
God.
is. There is. And it's still like I love French cinema. I really
Yeah.
do. But like you're always kind of sitting there. It's this but the more you watch, you're sitting there waiting. When is it gonna happen? When is someone gonna be, disgusting?
Hmm.
And it happens 9 times out of 10. And it's still happening. So it's like just a thing that they have not gotten over. And I hate that I enjoy the film so much, but it's always just like stuff like that. Thankfully, it's not as prominent in his other films. Usually people are
Yeah.
the same age, thankfully. And I think that's like a commentary that at least I'd like to view it that way, that he's commentating on that style of human being in Claire's Knee, but it's a difficult one to watch for sure. So I'd say My Night at Mods, Green Ray for sure, watch. And like you said, if those aren't for you, or if you didn't like them, then I would say his other stuff probably won't be for you because those are who he is, right? That's just his thing. My Night at Mods is him to a T. So yeah, you're not going to get many others like Percival in his filmography for sure. But second question, last question is a double bill. And if you're going to create a double bill and you could pick more than one film if you have other options with Percival, what film or films would you pick and what's the reason behind the pairing?
This one's actually pretty easy for me. I mentioned it before, but Robert Bresson's Lancelot du Lac, I think
Mhm.
it's like a perfect double bill for this. I mean, another famous French auteur creating a Arthurian legend adaptation in the 1970s, right? But also like the films are both similar and also different for really interesting reasons. So like I mentioned before, Bresson's is much more naturalistic, shot in like real forests. Also like way more violent than
Mm,
this film. Like it can get pretty gory in that movie, early too. But it has like similar themes of spirituality, Catholicism, finding faith, losing faith, which obviously are key things that are consistent throughout Bresson's filmography also. But yeah, I think that that would be like a really interesting pairing. Also, if you're a film programmer, Bresson's film's only 90 minutes and this film's like 2.5 hours. So, that fits within your slot pretty well, I would say.
oh yeah, exactly. That's also very important, right? You don't want something too long. Yeah, unlike what I picked for my first pick, actually, for my double bill. For some reason, the first half of this, not thematically, but visually, reminded me a lot of Juliet of the Spirits, and
Oh,
some of the flourishes there and the sets that were built for that. So I think when I was thinking of my pairings, for some reason I had the set design in my mind because I just couldn't get over how great the set design was in this. I think it was probably my favorite part of the whole film. And I actually, after this, I'm going to actively look to see what else that set designer has done. But Juliet of the Spirits, and then for some reason, again, sticking on weird sets and kind of play-like acting, it brought me, and this is not a double bill I would want to do, but if you're brave enough, you could watch it with Dogville. Lars von Trier.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that.
If you're going about it, if you're someone who wants to get into set design, I'd be like, yeah, watch these two and see what they were able to do with the space. And then one that's not my own, but I wrote it down just because I was reading about someone was comparing, and I'll put this in the show notes because the name is escaping me, but I have the website. They were comparing this to the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the sets.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
I thought, I was like, that makes sense. And then remember they had an interview, a portion with him talking to, he's like, he hated the comparison. He's like, it's not supposed to be like German expressionism. But then the author was like, but it kind of is though, like visually, and there's like side by side. So I'll have that in the show notes. But I thought that was really interesting because I didn't immediately think about it, but I was like, oh yeah, it definitely feels that way for sure. I don't think it's directly influenced by that era, but you can see that there is some, maybe the set designer was like, well, I want to go that route, even if you don't view it as that. So no, those would be my pairings. Duran, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I thought the conversation was great. I'm glad that you suggested this. I think it's important film to watch, especially if you're a fan of this director, and actually make a point of watching it. I don't know what it's on in the States, but it was on Tubi in Canada. So,
oh, cool.
But I think I'm pretty sure I saw it at my local library too, available to rent. So thank you so much for coming. And I don't know if you have anything you want to shout out, any plugs you want to plug before we wrap?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time with this. I mean, God knows when I would have watched this movie had it not been for this podcast. So I'm really glad that we did this. And I'm glad that seems like you enjoyed it too. This very, very strange film within a very great body of work. But yeah, on my end, just want to plug a couple things. Well, look out for my name soon. Hopefully we'll be publishing some film articles related to either Hong Kong cinema or Blacklist, the Hollywood Blacklist. Nice. So look up my name in a few months, hopefully, if everything goes well.
Yeah.
But beyond that, also, I want to shout out Chapman University's Students for Justice in Palestine. So I'm a master's student at Chapman University studying film studies, and also I joined the executive board for Chapman's SJP. And right now we are organizing walkouts and protests to try to get our school to divest from companies that currently support the genocide in Gaza. So you can follow us on Instagram at SJP Chapman. And from there you can go to our link tree and sign our change.org petition about divestment. So
amazing. No, thank you for that plug. I'll definitely put that in the show notes for people so they have a click out link. But also I'll check it out and sign the petition because I think that's really important work. So
thank you.
I think it's great work that you're doing. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia with intro music by Lemar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode on My Night at Moss.